Fonts have become a source of some Nintendo-related concern recently with the announcement of big changes at Fontworks. Fontworks was a Japanese font designer whose works were licensed to a great many Japanese gaming companies, but in 2023 they were taken over by US font giant Monotype. A public change to their licensing terms has really shaken people recently, though. Licenses that were once $380 a year are now $20,500 a year as part of a huge price jump, more than a 50 times increase, and with tight usage terms applied as well. This is likely to affect a vast number of Japanese game developers, but will it impact Nintendo? Nintendo has used Fontworks for years, and they're credited on all sorts of different titles. So have many other companies in Japan. Most striking are the fonts used in logos. I've seen graphics asserting a wide variety of Nintendo logos are affected, but while I've not found a primary source for these, I can certainly see that fonts have been used in many other titles, including more common but less high-profile examples like Animal Crossing New Horizons. The problem is, redoing fonts would mean huge testing costs. Also, the top-tier plan has a cap of 25,000 users. On the $20,500 plan, that would mean about 82 cents on every game sold could be going straight into Monotype. Now, those are based on purported standard fees for companies, but I can't imagine that Nintendo is ever paying a standard fee for many of the fonts it used, even when Fontworks still existed as an entity in its own right. My guess is that if they're putting up these prices for licenses going forward, then Monotype and Nintendo will have been having conversations for quite a long time before anything publicly changed. In the case of the Mario games, for example, we know that Nintendo redesigned their logo in collaboration with Fontworks in 2013. After all, some of these are commercial sensitive brand signifiers, and so ensuring proprietorial ownership of anything in a logo seems fairly basic due diligence for a legal department. Especially since 2023, my guess is that Nintendo will have taken steps to mitigate the immediate impact on their business, but the most commercially sensitive fonts seem unlikely to be affected. Beyond that, one would assume that Nintendo had considered and anticipated this before and negotiated unlimited distribution terms for any games where Fontworks fonts were being utilized. These terms would predate Fontworks' buyout, and Monotype would therefore not be able to unpick that arrangement under Japanese law. Note that on Nintendo's intellectual property notices on their website, Fontworks is listed not as a licensor, but as a special thanks. On Hyrule Warriors for Wii U, the legal terms for the use of the fonts are given as this software uses specially designed fonts created under license from Fontworks Inc. Fontworks and font names are trademarks or registered trademarks of Fontworks Inc. Well, this is subtly different from the special thanks arrangement, but this reflects the fact that Hyrule Warriors was developed by Koei Tecmo. This is also subtly different from the text on, for example, Capcom games, which states, "This software uses a font that is either made by or created based on a font made by Fontworks Inc., which has been modified to accommodate the software design." My guess is that the special thanks reflects some kind of existing long-term deal with Fontworks by Nintendo. However, third parties, including parties like HAL and Koei Tecmo of the Hyrule Warriors games, do use these fonts and may not be subject to the same terms. I've got no specialist knowledge of Japanese contract law, but my assumption would be that Monotype would inherit the obligations and arrangements made with Fontworks, and these are likely to have been made such that Nintendo wouldn't have exposure to exactly these kinds of long-term issues. Also, re-releases of games have been a part of Nintendo's strategy since the beginning. Even the Famicom Donkey Kong game was an arcade port, so negotiating re-releases was probably always a consideration in font negotiations. However, let's assume that not every contract was airtight and look at a few examples that could prove problematic under these circumstances. Example 1. Animal Crossing New Horizons. The main font used for its in-game text is, I believe, from Fontworks, and the title is zoning in on 50 million users plus a Nintendo Switch 2 re-release in 2026. Through Happy Home Paradise, it is effectively being resold year on year, and while not every user will sign up to the expansion pack, if they did, it could be a $43 million annual cost just for that title under the terms publicly set out by Monotype. Example 2. Some of the older WarioWare and Kirby games which used Fontworks logos and which are now on Nintendo Switch Online. Nintendo want to be able to offer these games to customers in perpetuity. They do not want to be going back into the code of ancient titles to redo fonts. Under these circumstances, Nintendo would theoretically have two options. One is to negotiate hard. This is tricky because Monotype would have a huge amount of leverage here as long as the fonts are embedded into games, but Nintendo is still a large user of fonts and over multiple years. Under normal circumstances, they should be a very secure and reliable partner, and losing them as a client will be problematic for any business. Therefore, Nintendo is also fairly well placed to make a good deal. The second is to pivot to their own set of fonts. Here we have to consider short-term against long-term costs. A running bill of millions per game is ultimately going to be more expensive than an extremely high short-term cost of redoing in-game fonts. Many Japanese companies won't be able to pay this, but with Nintendo's vast reserves, they are prepared for exactly this kind of surprise shock, although they might well look at certain games and think that they're not worth the effort, particularly on Nintendo Switch Online. While the testing barrier will be high, this would secure Nintendo for the long term, but it could mean pulling a number of games in the medium term, and it might be a block for older Nintendo Switch Online games, tying them up in unnecessary licensing hell and potentially blocking any further meaningful releases. On balance, my expectation is that Nintendo will probably already have had proprietary arrangements with Fontworks that will continue to extend to Monotype. Monotype will doubtless want to stress test their deals, so it will generate time and costs for Nintendo's legal team if this happens, but that's why a company like Nintendo has lawyers in the first place. The bigger concern, it strikes me, is for many, many other smaller developers who have used Fontworks fonts without the ability to secure for themselves special terms by dint of their size or simply a lack of foresight. Many of these companies will work with Nintendo or will want to sell their games on Nintendo platforms, and hurting these groups on narrow margins would have an impact on Nintendo indirectly. Now, usually I'll put a forecast on this kind of thing, but it's very difficult to come up with a forecast term for something so inside baseball as fonts, where changes might be subtle and not publicly announced. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see evolution of fonts within new games, and this might just be one of the reasons for this to happen. But unless Shuntaro Furukawa is asked directly in an investor Q&A, I see no reason why Nintendo would publicly comment on this situation at this time. That's it for this video. Check out the videos on screen. Thanks so much for watching. Big thanks to the Patreon community, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.